Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, this is episode 8, we think. We're probably going to get like 100 episodes in and be like 12 episodes off on our numbering system, but neither us nor anyone else will ever know. And if we get to 100,
Yeah.
if we get to 100, we should feel proud of ourselves, even if the math is off in the end. So we talked about consciousness last time. Our last episode was sort of introducing what we feel like consciousness is and what it does. And then ultimately, we got around to the question of, is it worth it? Is it worth going through the process, the hard work, the pain, and the strain, really, of becoming conscious? Would it not be better to just go to sleep, so to speak, go to sleep to ourselves, go to sleep to our experiences, and sort of turn that dial down on consciousness so we don't have to experience all the pain that comes along with it. And that was a good episode, I think. That was a good discussion if you haven't listened to it. Today I want to go through Eric Neumann's description of the history of consciousness, because that's how we got this topic started. We were talking about Eric Neumann's book, The History and Origins of Consciousness. Eric Neumann, for reference, is one of Jung's best friends, was one of Jung's best friends, and one of his proteges, and one of his, apparently, one of his toughest critics or adversaries. I think they went back and forth a little bit on ideas, which I would imagine was very rare for Carl Jung once he was out from under Freud's shadow. There probably weren't too many intellectual adversaries for him to spar with, but it sounds like Eric Neumann was one of those guys. And he wrote The Origins and History of Consciousness, which I just finished. And it's just an extremely dense book, but it's absolutely fascinating. So he lays out, it's not historical in the sense of necessarily timelines like, 1000 BC, 500 BC, but he lays out the myth, the mythology, the archetypes that go along with each stage of consciousness, and how each stage of consciousness produces in the world a corresponding set of myths and a corresponding set of religious practices and rituals and culture and all the things that go along with it. And again, just for reference, when we talk about myth, we're not talking about made up stories. We're talking about the narratives that guide people's belief systems throughout, human, um, throughout all the human stages. So
Yeah. We're talking about something that makes a truth claim.
that's better said. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, all right, Nate, I'll go through this sort of the symbolism that Neumann lays out, and you can tell me if you think this makes sense, if this resonates with you, or what sticks out to you about the way Neumann puts this together.
All right, let's do
So,
it.
so he introduces the topic with the uroboros. So that's Ourobros, which I just learned today how to pronounce it. Uroboros. Uroboros. That's it. Uroboros. The Uroboros. It's this image of the circular snake eating its tail. So you've got the tail of the snake in its own mouth, and it's this circular symbol. And I didn't make notes of all the places that this symbol shows up, but Neumann goes into great detail. Apparently, this sort of circular snake, sometimes it's a dragon, this sort of self-contained animal, this self-contained circle wheel shows up in all kinds of cultures all over the world throughout history. Peoples and places that would have no access to each other to share mythology, according to Neumann. So he his claim is that this uroboros is the symbol of unconsciousness. It's this self-contained, um, like timelessness, this like non-beginning, this this symbol that had of non-existence, really, like no beginning and no end. It just is. It's just this reality that's contained. It was never created. It will never go away. But it's represented as a feminine, as this womb, as the origin from which all things are born. So this snake eating its tail is this circular, timeless non-existence. It's like sleep. It's the womb. It's essentially the great mother, and it's feminine not because the snake is female. It's feminine because it's like a womb where all things are birthed out of it. It's the original source. It's not necessarily the ground of being, but it's like its existence itself from which consciousness will eventually emerge. So it's unconsciousness. It's a womb. It's what Neumann calls the great mother. But it's this timeless womb where there is no differentiation. There's no light and dark. There's no young, old. It just is without age, without any differentiation, with no opposites, just one reality. So that becomes symbolized. The uroboros becomes the symbol of the Great Mother, of unconsciousness, and unconsciousness becomes symbolized as the Great Mother, the womb. It's like the belly of the whale, the bottom of the ocean. It's the beginning. And so once man, that initial birth moment of consciousness, when man becomes aware of himself, when man discovers that he is something different than the world, that he is somehow delineated from what's around him. It's me and then it's you, or me and then the world. Then he emerges from the womb. It's like the seed germinates and then sprouts out of this uroboros womb. But it's like a phallic emergence, a protrusion and a bursting forth from unconsciousness. That moment when man experiences himself. And so the ego is born, and the ego becomes like this, like the seed, the sperm, and it's phallic, and it becomes masculine. Again, not as in male and female, but as in represented in these terms of feminine and masculine. The ego consciousness emerges as masculine, and the unconscious is represented as the feminine snake eating its tail. But what happens is, and what Neumann shows in the mythology of the ages, is that that first ego that germinates, that first awareness that man has of himself, is like super feeble. It's like not strong at all. It's not certain of anything. It's just this little inkling of me and the world. And so the pull, there's this great mother. The unconscious is this like powerful force. And so the unconscious is trying to pull the ego back into unconsciousness, because it's so feeble and frail and new, that the temptation is for man to just forget about himself as differentiated and to go back into the great mother. But the symbolism of that ego emerging, what the symbolism that comes along with it are the opposites. Immediately you get day and night, like that's the image. We get this hero, this man who is literally separating this, like the day from the night, the sun from the moon. He's like doing the work of creating the opposites, because the first thing that happens when he becomes aware of himself versus other is that he becomes aware of day versus night, light versus dark, male, female. He becomes aware he becomes aware of opposites. Once he differentiates himself from the world, then he starts differentiating all of the different components of the world. So you get the raw sun god of Egypt. Like that's the first god is the god of the sun. It's the god who puts the sun in the sky as like the first symbol of consciousness is light. Light becomes the first symbol of consciousness. And you get the sun gods. Every culture, every religion, every people group has, ancient people group had a sun god, like the primary god. Even the Greeks have I'm not good with Greek mythology, but the one who pulls the sun up in the morning, who drags the sun across the sky. Is it Apollo? I don't know. But then you've got the biblical creation where earth is separated from sky, light is separated from dark, water is separated from land. That's the first thing that happens when man becomes conscious is the opposites emerge. And you get these heroes and gods and mythical characters who then create these opposites. They separate the light from the dark. They create essentially they create male and female. They create heaven and earth. That's another fundamental one. So that's like the first chronologically. The ego germinates from the uroboros becoming somewhat conscious of himself, and then all of a sudden these opposites emerge, and then the narratives come in to explain the opposites. Does that make sense? Does that track?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm with you.
So then, and this is where the stories start to get interesting, is the young male ego, because the ego is represented archetypally as male. The young male ego is tempted then to go back to unconsciousness for the same reasons that we talked about last time. Like it's just easier to live in the unconscious. It's more difficult to do the work of creating, separating night from dark, light from dark, night from day. So, and the pull of the Great Mother is so strong that you get Oedipus Rex. You get the baby who is separated from his parent, who the king in Oedipus Rex, the Greek myth, the king removes the child because the child is a threat to some far off land. When the child grows up, Oedipus Rex, when the child grows up, he comes back, meets the king, doesn't know he's the king, and kills the old man, not knowing that it's his father and not knowing that it's the king. And then because he defeats the old man, he takes the queen as his wife. Well, the queen is actually his mother. He doesn't know this. So that's the Oedipus Rex story. And Freud Freud made this myth about sex, about incest, and it was like this, the mother fixation, And all of these complexes, he invented the Oedipus complex, where it's like his theory was like every small boy fantasizes about having his mother be his wife as like a toddler and into until adolescence basically. And then you have this complex where you're like looking for your mother in your wife, but you're not conscious of it. And Neumann is like that. No, that's so stupid. Neumann's Neumann's like, no, it's conscious. It's a metaphor for consciousness. Like Oedipus Rex is the germinal ego, the initial ego that's fragile and is tempted to go back to unconsciousness, to go back to the infantile state. It's the temptation is to go back to being an infant where you're cared for by your mother. The temptation is to blind yourself to the world and live in that sort of it's a death. It's like a peaceful death. It's like this temptation to drift into a peaceful non-existence. And the myth is Oedipus Rex is represented as the ego. And that characterized a whole stage of human development. Like the initial stage of human consciousness was Oedipus Rex. It was that fragile germinal ego who wanted to like go back, who wanted to, who was tempted to pull back from adult consciousness into an infantile unconscious. Does that, you think those dots connect?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's where I'm going as you're talking. I tried to bring up the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve a couple of weeks ago, and you told me I was getting ahead of myself, that we would get there. And as I start thinking about origin stories, obviously this is going to be the one that's like most familiar to my context, right? Is the story in Genesis about the creation or the stories about the creation of the world. And there are some really interesting similarities, obviously, and then there are a couple of like key differences that I think are worth talking about. But you can rein me in if I'm just pulling it out of left field.
No, go
So
ahead.
first of
This will
all,
be fun.
the journey of Oedipus that you just described as the journey of consciousness, right? So
Mm.
to like take it to emancipate it from Freud and reframe it as a journey of consciousness, returning back, and then eventually the desire to fall back asleep or to fall back into whatever that thing is, you know. So if we parallel that to the story of the creation stories in Genesis, it's interesting that first, like the description that the authors of Genesis use for what the world was before it was anything is, what is it? Formless and void.
Yes, formless and empty.
Formless and
Yeah,
empty. Formless and
yeah.
void. That and then it's really strange language. That the spirit of the spirit of God was hovering over the waters of the deep, and darkness covered everything. So we're both describing its form and its characteristics, and also saying that it has no form and that it's empty, right? So we're like immediately embracing this contradiction on the surface, but what we're really talking about is nothingness, right? Of a thing, like a thing exists, but it's nothing.
Right.
Uh, and so I think those track. The second thing that I think is interesting is for the the Genesis creation stories, it doesn't begin with the woman. It begins with the man. And from the man, according to the story, woman emerges. She's formed. Um, Whereas in the consciousness, in the what is it, Ouroboros, in
Hmm.
according to that map, it's first the feminine, and then the masculine emerges as consciousness out of the feminine. So I thought that was like an interesting deviation. The next thing that I thought was interesting, Matt, is if we parallel these two, is to think about the Genesis creation story. It's really fascinating if you take like the first few chapters of Genesis, and instead of thinking about it as this like idyllic paradise, um, and like uh, place all of this emphasis on sin separating us from God, and like there's some Christian story that we have to know about this. If you read it as Yahweh creates something out of nothing, and then Yahweh also is becoming self-aware in relation to human beings becoming self-aware. So Yahweh now has a new other to differentiate Yahweh's self from. And if you take like through the fall and really into like Cain and Abel, and you read it as Yahweh trying to figure out the terms of the agreement with humans, Yahweh is negotiating with humans, right? Like with Cain and Abel, Yahweh makes a point and makes a pronunciation and then gets talked out of it. And if you see the arc of the story as Yahweh and humanity becoming self-aware out of nothingness as they encounter one another, then you see like expelling human beings from Eden, from this idyllic, right? This idyllic shalom, this idyllic safe uh, environment, to a world full of stimuli and threats and otherness. um, then I think it can track with that consciousness myth in that way, right? Where rather than rather than Adam and Eve breaking the rules, the arbitrary rules that Yahweh set up, and Adam and Eve break the rules, and then Yahweh says, "Well, let's just go back to the way it was before." It's a conscious decision to say, "No, we're going to move forward into the next experience of humanity based upon the conscious choices that we've made now that we're all aware of one another's existence." Does I think I just covered a lot of ground and I pulled a lot of that out of my ass, but I
No,
think
you're
it
on the right.
works. In
Yeah,
some ways, it
100%.
can really work.
Yeah, because I think if we read it, if we read Genesis, the beginning, first few chapters of Genesis, as like, okay, here's the first account, here's the oldest account of God, like making laws. And how do people respond to God's laws? And sin and punishment and separation. Like, I think we miss what's actually happening in the story, because you have it is it's the origin of the world of consciousness. Like, the first couple of chapters are how the world emerged through consciousness. You've got this non-existent Genesis is trying to describe non-existence as best it can in the deep and the void and the formless. It's just this sort of chaotic nothingness, but there's no such thing as nothingness. So it's the deep, and it's the womb. It's like the belly of the whale. It's like neither death nor life. But then God organizes it, separates and and makes order from the chaos, and then puts man in it. Okay, so here's the male female part of this. You've got man just sort of unconscious, just following his instincts. Adam is just following his instincts. Well, then the woman, God says it's not good for man to be alone. So Eve shows up. God creates Eve, and she makes Adam self-conscious. Oh, the feminine females make males self-conscious. That's what they do. Like in the presence of the feminine, in the presence of females, the male becomes conscious of himself. Like, what am I, all of a sudden it's like, am I doing this right? How does my hair look? Like, you become self-conscious. So Eve brings the consciousness to Adam. And they say that the word for Eve is not really helper, but it's like a help. The Hebrew word is like set against. It's like a help set against. She's like set against him in order to make him more conscious. And so it is a paradise. So that you've got this Garden of Eden that is a paradise, but it's not, but it's like pre-consciousness. And so when they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and all of a sudden the opposites emerge, like naked and clothed, alone, together, all of the good and evil, because they ate of the fruit of knowledge, then consciousness takes hold and everything becomes polarized. They can see the difference between male and female. They can see the difference between naked and clothed and good and evil. And then uh, they're probably not, like, Adam is probably not changing what he does when he gets kicked out of the garden, but because he's aware of his own mortality, all of a sudden farming and working the ground becomes like terrifying. It's like, if there's a drought, I die. If I don't dig this hole, I die. If I don't find if it doesn't rain, I die. All of a sudden work becomes work. All of a sudden gardening went from being just sort of instinctive in harmony with the universe. Now it's work because of consciousness.
It's survival, right?
That yes.
It goes from my role as part of the larger idyllic universe that I'm a part of to I must now survive. At times in spite of or set against the universe.
Yes.
Like when there's a drought, I still have to make this world work for me.
Whereas before he's just an animal. There's not even a me. It's just like a bird or a dog just looking for the next meal, or hiding under a tree during a storm. There's no worry about there is no life and death in the mind of Adam before the fall. There is only
That's so weird.
right. Yeah. It's so weird. That's why we miss it. That's why we miss that part of this. like the main part of the story because it doesn't even make sense. I mean, it makes sense, but it is weird. And so all of a sudden, once you can see once you can see the end of your life and you fear it, then work becomes painful. Then it's like I have to do this to survive, and I hate this. This is so hard, and I'm so scared of not of dying. And so the whole story is just an emerging consciousness. And basically what the sin is, uh, this is speculation, but the sin is that Eve is tries to take all of consciousness onto uh, to herself at once. She tries to take she tries to take, and that's what God is saying, don't eat this tree because you're not ready for this fruit. You're not ready to take on all of this knowledge. It will give you anxiety and fear, and it will ruin paradise for you, is basically what he's saying. If you eat this tree, it will ruin paradise because you're not capable of integrating all of this knowledge right now. And the interesting thing to think about is, did God have a plan for gradually bringing about consciousness in his own terms and timeline for Adam and Eve, or for early man? Because we know is that Eve just hijacked the process and bypassed whatever speed bumps that God had put in the way, and she tried to take it. That's the pride. The pride is that I can handle it. I can handle this the size of this download, me within my own cognitive abilities. Just give it to me. Give me the download, give me the update. There's not going to be any bugs. There's not going to be any problems. Well, all of a sudden, our hardwire just short circuits. It's just anxiety, fear, depression. And then we try to go back to that's why we try to go back to the garden. And God is the angel with the flaming swords is not it's symbolic. It's you can't go back. You can't get in there. Like unless you die. I mean, unless you want to physically die, you can't get back to you can't go back to the old operating system. You can't go back to unconsciousness once you've eaten the fruit. You can't undo the opposites. You have to now go through consciousness to get back to unity. You can't undo consciousness to get back to unity. There's an angel there with flaming swords. There's no way to get through.
Yeah, I think there's an element of this story as it relates to consciousness that also has to do with um, Adam and Eve's interaction as after they eat the fruit, and then that extends to to the questions Yahweh asks Adam and Eve. So, um, so Adam and Eve, when they both eat the fruit, right, and and think about how funny this consequence is, Matt. Out of all of the things that they could become conscious of or aware of, they realize they don't have any clothes on. In the entire universe,
Yeah.
this whole paradise in Eden, and what do they notice? I'm not wearing any pants.
Where's my pants?
Yeah, it's that they suddenly become aware of their own being.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was tracking with your description of Neumann and the this myth of consciousness that I don't know if you said opposites, but or contradictory elements, but basically something other than me
Hmm.
emerges, and out of that, I learn more about who I am. I become more aware of my being. That as Adam and Eve eat the fruit, look at each other, and suddenly they get embarrassed.
Hmm.
It's not just that they realize that they don't have any clothes on, they get embarrassed. So there is a feeling that is related to me specifically, to my to my awareness of my body.
Hmm.
What they didn't do is laugh at the other one for not having any clothes on. In other words, their thought is directed to the self
Yes.
as it stands in front of the other.
Yes.
Suddenly, I have this knowledge of who I am as I stand in front of or in the gaze of the being that is across from me, that is not me.
Hmm.
It's that kind of like self knowledge, I don't know, consciousness, right? And
Yeah.
then think about the questions that Yahweh asks Adam and Eve because they freak out, they go and hide, and Yahweh is, I mean, it's just, man, it's such a like a funny, brilliant, weird story. Yahweh is walking through the garden. He's strolling through the Garden of Eden, um, and he asks Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" Now, I think the story probably suggests this, that the interaction is like Yahweh's actually searching for them, and it may even say that explicitly. I should go back and read before I like say what's happening. But what if we read it a different way? What if we read it as Yahweh, just as is Yahweh asking Adam and Eve, "Do you know where you are?"
Hmm.
So instead of asking for Yahweh's own clarification, "Where are you?" What if instead the question is, "Where are you?" as in, "Do you know where you are?" Self-knowledge, self-consciousness.
Yeah.
In the context of your environment, can you name this? All of this otherness that informs your sense of location or self. Um, so I think that's like such a fascinating element
Yeah.
of the Hebrew story of the origins of all of the universe, right? Like we start off, if you look at the narrative arc of the story, we start off with all of the cosmos that is nothing. It's a description of the number zero. That's what Genesis is trying to do by saying the earth is formless and void, trying
Hmm.
to assign a number to something that does not exist, zero. I have I have zero of these. Well, if you have zero of them, then they don't exist. So what is the this? What are the these?
Right.
Right? And so it's limitless, it has no boundaries, it's infinitely expanding. And out of this thing, out of this number zero, Yahweh creates and crafts and sculpts this world and spins it and creates the things that are going to inhabit it in order to ensure order in the world. Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, who apparently, and this is their first interaction together, right? That's even recorded,
Yeah.
is eating the fruit. And the first thing, we go from this massive, infinite, expansive nothingness in the cosmos to the experience of being naked, of a human being embarrassed of being naked. That's the arc of the story.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah. And it takes like 4 pages of text to get there.
Yes. And again, Adam and Eve don't point at each other and say, "Hey, you're naked, put some clothes on." They are embarrassed that they are naked. So they're actually self-conscious. They're looking at themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the serpent, so they're pointing at the other. But when it comes to that moment of acknowledging their own existence, it happens when they realize they are naked.
Yeah. Because when they look, they see the other and go, that's not me. That's not what I look like. That's what the thought is. You see the other and you think that's what the ego does. You see when you see the other, you think about yourself. It's like I see Eve and that's not me, right? That's not what my physical form looks like. So what's going on here? And the other part is that the nakedness, the sexuality of it is a big part of it. But the other part is a vulnerability. They look at
That's right.
themselves, they look at themselves and go, I'm like exposed to the elements. And this, like, I'm not and I'm not a rhinoceros. Like like I feel the rhinoceros and I feel me and I'm different. I'm like, I could die. Like that rhino over here could kill me. That lion over there could kill me. I got to do something to protect myself. It's like I'm exposed and naked and embarrassed. And oh, yeah, I'm also defenseless. Like you could cut right through this belly and I would die. And so, Jonathan Pageau, who I love, talks about the garments of skin that they put on as like a way to become like the more invulnerable animals they see around them. Like, oh, that bear, nothing can kill that bear over there. Let me put on a bear skin to protect myself. It's like it's the first technology. Like the first thing the second thing really that happens. The first thing that happens is they realize they're naked and they get embarrassed and afraid. And then the second thing that happens is technology. They go, let me find something in the world to add to myself to make me less naked and afraid, to make me less vulnerable. It's and then but that's what God is warning them about. That's why they're not supposed to eat of the tree, is because all of a sudden then they just take from the world and start adding to themselves. Once you have the knowledge of your own vulnerability, and you see, like in 2 chapters later, where technology gets you, like Cain, kills Abel, and then he goes and starts building cities. It's like immediately it goes wrong. And then, Lamech is just this like, and I think in the book of Enoch, it goes into this like a lot. It's just like Adam and Eve put on fur, Cain kills Abel, and then everyone just starts building weapons. Everyone starts making weapons. That's like cities and weapons. It's like walls and weapons. They Adam, the first sin, knowledge of good and evil, and then Cain goes, okay, I know what to do now. Kills Abel, and then they just start building walls and weapons, and that's the rest of human history.
It's it's it is like a post-apocalyptic world that Cain and Abel are inhabiting. So
Mm-hmm.
post-fall, at least that's how I think of it. So post-fall, when Yahweh says you can't go back to unconscious, you can't go back to unconsciousness, you can't go back to idyllic ignorance. You ate the fruit, you realized you were naked, and now we're going to have to deal with it, right? Enter Cain and Abel, and you have immediately conflict between herding groups and agricultural groups, right? So nomadic peoples and settled peoples. And Yahweh creates the conflict by privileging and saying, I like this sacrifice of the animal, or what, I like this sacrifice more than that one. I like Abel's sacrifice more than Cain's because
Hmm.
I value this, whatever resource this is, that's the better one. It's completely arbitrary, according to the text at least. It's kind of capricious. Like, it doesn't say why.
Yeah.
It's like Yahweh is still trying to figure out what the rules are, what the terms are. Yahweh is still trying to create some kind of order, becoming self-aware in relation to, suddenly I've got this problem. I have two different sacrifices that are being brought to me.
Hmm.
Well, I right. So I've got to differentiate now. It's almost like you can see Yahweh being like, well, I wasn't ready for this. I like that. I'm going to pick that one.
Yeah.
Then there's conflict immediately between Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, right? And the conversation between Yahweh and Cain is wild. They're both trying to figure out the rules.
Hmm.
So Yahweh comes to Cain and says, we've all heard it. Where's your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? I don't know. But what he's really doing is putting it back on Yahweh and saying, that's not my role in the universe. That's your role in the universe, is to know where your people are. When we were expelled from the garden, that wasn't part of the terms of the agreement. And then Yahweh makes a pronunciation, and he says, you're gonna, again, you're expelled. You're out of here. You're gonna wander. And this is like Mad Max. Cain is terrified because he describes like wild packs of humans out there
Hmm.
that are going to find him and harm him, just roving out there in the world. And he can't be sent out alone. And so
Yeah.
Yahweh, puts the mark on his forehead and says, all right, so I'm going to put this on your forehead and everyone will know, don't mess with you. But Cain negotiates with Yahweh and puts the onus back on God. They're going back and forth about who's actually responsible in this new world of being conscious.
Hmm.
Like, from the earliest part of that story, Yahweh puts it on Cain and says, if you just give me the right sacrifice, you wouldn't have any reason to, we'd be fine. And it says, Cain, be careful. Sin is lurking outside your tent. It means to have you. And there's this almost like sexual, well, there is a sexual connotation to that. Lurking and means to have you. It's meaning to assault and take Cain, right?
Hmm.
But Cain just puts it right back on God. And so there's this like this consciousness, I think, as they negotiate to figure out, where are my boundaries of self, right? How far does my power or control extend? And
Right.
I don't want to spin this too far out away from our topic, Matt, but I think in that conflict, Yahweh and Cain are figuring things out about themselves and what they want. In other words, they're becoming more self-conscious.
Yeah. Well, you can see that to me this looks like Cain. It looks like early man and Cain as early man's representative, struggling to go back to wanting to go back to unconsciousness, wanting to go back because unconsciousness was just instinct. It was just find food and make babies. It was just eat and procreate. It's just animal instincts.
It's just your dog, right?
It's just a dog. Or a wolf, an eagle, whatever. It's just eat and replicate. And you know, so Cain is going, well, what do you expect? Like this way of my instincts are pretty good. Abel was getting in my way, and now he's not getting in my way. So what he's like, God, you created this place. These are the rules you put, this is on you. Like, what do you expect? You didn't tell me not to do that. Like, these are just you gave me these instincts. I have instincts. Where would these instincts come from if they didn't come from you? You created me. I'm just following my instincts. So it's like early man wanting to go back instead of using consciousness to then create, to push through the pain of having to share the world with other, instead of having to push through that conflict to create a new unity. The temptation is to go back to the old, where I don't feel anything. I keep giving myself light bubbles on my I keep giving myself thumbs up bubbles. But the temptation is to go back to the old unity where I am just one with the world because I'm asleep and my neurons just fire. This is how they fire. But the other part of this that you're getting at, what Neumann would say is that these early stories, the earliest stories, and I mean maybe any story that we tell about God, is mostly a projection of what's happening inside of us, and then we project that story onto God in some way, shape, or form. And so, if you're looking at the story from Neumann's perspective, you've got the early whoever's telling these stories initially, whoever's telling the Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel story initially, because we don't know when the stories began. We have some idea when they're written down. We have no idea where they came from. But whoever's telling these stories is projecting themselves onto God, and then it's like Inception. And then they're they're talking about Cain's. Then they're detailing Cain's projections of himself onto God. And so you can imagine whoever's telling this original Cain and Abel story is thinking, well, looking at two tribes, the herdsmen and the farmers, and going, well, one of these has got to be better. God has to, whoever created this, whoever's in charge around here, I'm sure he favors one or the other. And so even that dichotomy, even that decision of God choosing one over the other, Neumann would say, well, whoever's writing that story, whoever's telling that story is projecting that onto God, because they feel it within themselves. There's a right and a wrong. There's a good and evil. There's a right way to live and a wrong way to live. Therefore, if God is in the business of right and wrong, well, I'm sure he likes one better than the other. I'm sure one sacrifice is better than the other. And and so you've got to take into consideration that's not to negate any of the meaning and the value of the story to say that it's a projection. It's meaningful because it is a projection, because it references our experiences and what's happening inside of us, and we project it in our story so that we can engage with it. We couldn't engage with it if we didn't project it. I don't even know if I can wrap my own head around what I'm saying, but that's what Neumann is. That's what he lays out. in his book.
Yeah. I, I mean, a couple of things. One is that, Matt, uh, we're talking about projections, and that's completely right. I mean, I think that's accurate. I think that actually makes the most sense. So let's look at Cain and Abel. So Cain brings grain and the first fruits. Cain's a farmer, right? Abel brings livestock. So Cain is agrarian, Abel's nomadic, a nomadic herdsman. Well, so Cain Cain is agrarian, Abel is nomadic. Well, let's look at the authors of the story, Matt. Where are like the early Hebrews living? What is their context? They're nomadic. And who are they surrounded by? Agrarian societies. Look at them like wandering in the desert.
Yeah.
They're constantly othering themselves, comparing themselves over and against these cities that they have to contend with. And they're also God's chosen, Yahweh's chosen people. So of course, as they write this story, it's going to be written from their own context. Of course, Yahweh prefers the the firstborn calf or whatever over the grapes from your vineyard, because people wandering in the desert don't grow. They don't have vineyards, man. Right? So of course it's a projection. And I think the second thing is that when we understand it that way, when we understand it as people trying to make sense out of their own experience to figure out how did we get here, this becomes not just the most reasonable, I think, way to read it, but so damn interesting. The
Hmm.
least interesting and least helpful way, in my opinion, to read this is as like scientific or historical literature. Um, the whole thing, I mean, it's full of contradictions if you look at it in that lens. But if you try to put yourself in the context and interpret what you're reading through these different lenses, in this case through the lens of consciousness, then you find out it's has far more to say about uh, our musings of how we got here than it does about any kind of any kind of absolute truth claim of the world being created in 6 days and Yahweh sleeping on the seventh. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It
When you,
becomes such a rich text. And I've never really unpacked it the way that you've laid out here with consciousness. But but it becomes like so much more flexible and pliable and applicable and to what my life is like, what my
yes,
experience is.
well,
I'm here
that's it.
for it, man.
100%. Because if you look at scripture really in totality as describing the way reality is, describing the way the world is, describing the nature and the structure of reality, as opposed to scripture describing what God is telling us to make the world, as opposed to what God is telling us to do or how God wants the world to be. If you look at it in the sense that it is describing the nature of reality itself, then you can take even the symbol of nomadic herds people and agrarian farming societies, and you look and you go, well, let's look at agrarian farming societies. They start to centralize as a little group or a little tribe. They literally put down roots, and they grow around this farm. Well, then what happens next? Then they create a little community, then they create a little structure, then they create some guidelines, then it builds into this sort of these agreements. Now you've got multiple families, and now we have to have some rules, and now we have to have some technology. We've got to find a way to get outside water in. We've got to start, okay, we've got some surplus. What do we do with our surplus? Should we sell it? Who should we sell it to? All of a sudden, you start adding these structures. Well, now we have 100 families, and now we've got to make streets, and now we've got to have a government, and now we have to have more technology. And then you see the Tower of Babel emerge. You've got these agrarian societies who put down roots and develop into cities and then city states. And then at some point, they become so self sustaining and they become so integrated with technology that they become prideful and they go, you know what? We could just build ourselves a tower all the way to heaven. We could just do this ourselves. We can reach however high we want to reach if we stay organized and we follow these codes and these laws and we follow the systems that we have in place. The sky is literally the sky is the limit. And so you've got these nomadic Israelite, Hebrew, Abrahamic, pre-Abrahamic people groups going, that doesn't look right. I don't think that's right. Like, I don't think that's the best way to be in the world. Like, that seems like it's too much order. Like, we got this story about chaos to order, and then it looks like the Tower of Babel seems like too much order. There's got to be some balance between chaos and order. And all of a sudden, you've got these early people trying to articulate the difference between articulate the warnings of too much chaos and too much order. And you go, holy shit, how did they do that? How did these people from so long ago organize their thoughts like this? And it's not just God going, sheep are better than grapes. Because that's the least interesting way to see these stories, as God telling people what to do, as opposed to these stories describing the way reality works, the way the world works, the way that God has created the world to work. And that's,
for a specific group of people in a specific context at a specific time, right?
yes, but in
And
this
Neumann's
case,
claim is that it transcends those small contexts. Is that right?
yeah. So I would say the greater the myth, the greater the story, the more it transcends. And so the more it transcends, the greater the story. And that's why these stories have persisted for so long. And that's why the Judeo Christian narrative has never been overcome by all the other counter narratives because it transcends in so many different ways from beyond this. It is, yes, in this specific context, specific people, specific time, and specific language, but be, the universals are so transcendent that it resonates with the way the world works for me and you now.
Yeah. Well, gunpowder and smallpox also helped also helped elevate the myth, um, to to spread the Judeo-Christian way of life. Um,
Yeah.
but I think one last point about, you mentioned the Tower of Babel. It's interesting to me that Yahweh has to confuse them and send them out. The idea with the Tower of Babel is that they're going to build a tower to reach God, and apparently this is a real threat, because Yahweh has to actually confuse them and stop the project, right? If there's no way they could actually accomplish the thing and get to God, then why would Yahweh even be concerned?
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's a part of this story that we don't talk about much, and I would say it's part of this, maybe this arc of Yahweh and human beings becoming self-aware of their limitations and their possibilities. Right? It's like Yahweh gets the Tower of Babel, and he's like, "Oh, they might actually do this. I can't let that happen." Right?
Yeah.
Because who am I if they get there? How am I going to differentiate myself from them if they're able to get up to where I am? And human beings are realizing, I might actually be able to. We might actually be able to make it. Why couldn't we? Right?
So if you,
And so Yahweh has to intervene and dispel them.
but if you look at it as, if you look at God as the ground of being, the ground of reality itself, you have the Hebrew projection of God as telling as arbitrarily going in to the city of Babel, confusing them and causing, he it had to intervene. God had to personally intervene with this project to bring it to ruin. But again, if you see this story as a tale of the way reality works, as the way the world works, and God as the ultimate reality, hubris, pride comes before the fall. When you say, as a people, there's when a people group says we have transcended, we can transcend God, we've developed enough cognitive horsepower to do anything we set our minds to. You get the Tower of Babel coming to ruin. You get the Nazi Reich coming to ruin. Empire. The point of the story is empires built on hubris, on pride and technology and human willpower will implode. They will collapse on themselves because that kind of control can't be, that kind of top down control is tyranny. And tyranny, that kind of top down control ultimately becomes tyranny every time. And the people, the whole descends into its parts.
Yeah,
The
and
parts
and
become the
only
whole.
Yahweh gets to be a tyrant.
And yeah, and he's the only good tyrant. So he must be the one. He's controlling reality. So if this is reality, then it's him. So whatever happens in reality is God. But it's just a story of the parts become a whole and then go back to being the parts again. It's this it's this cycle of the atomization and collectivization, atomization, collectivization, and they're just describing the way these things work. And every time things get too collectivized, they're doomed to reatomize. And so it gets weird. If you don't look at it like that, it gets weird. God favors sheep over grapes, and he's threatened by these ancient people building towers, tall towers. Like that's weird. But it doesn't do the story justice, and it doesn't help. It's not helpful to us as humans, modern humans, to look back and go, what do I don't build big towers, I guess. Make my church building a simple structure. Like that's what you have to take out of it if you don't understand what is the real meaning of the story.
Yeah. I'd just say one thing about that is that I think it's in the context of what we've talked about, it's a meaning of the story. It's a possible way to understand the story, right? That we can read into this, like other people from other contexts can look into the story and be like, oh shit, here's what's really happening. Or there are other ways to pull meaning out of that story, I think, out of that story beyond the myth of the emergence of consciousness. That there can be truth claims that are being made beyond that are not, it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Yeah,
So the article for me, as we read the story, the article that we use is not the interpretation, but an interpretation.
yeah. Well, now we're into a whole new discussion of interpreting stories. And yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, there's a million ways to interpret every story. So can we interpret stories? So if there's a million ways, then there's no ways. I mean, if there's an unlimited number of ways to interpret a story, then that means there's zero ways to interpret a story because none of them work. There, then there is no, then there's no meaning. So the interpretation has to match up. We can only interpret the stories to the degree that we can match up the story with the way we experience the world.
Matt, I can't tell if you're making an argument for or against postmodernism.
It's both. It's both and.
I'll sign up for that.
Yeah.
I'm on board.
We'll do we've reached our time limit, but we'll do an episode on postmodernism.
Yeah. Okay, that'll be fun.
Because we're only like halfway through the chronology of the history of. We haven't even made it to Egypt yet, and Egypt is like the most powerful mythology of them all. But this was fun.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Yeah.
All right, folks, we're gonna wrap it up there. We'll be back. We'll be back next time with episode whatever number we arbitrarily agree upon prior to the episode.
36.
Thanks, y'all. 36. There we go.